Well, I'm gonna get a little techie this time around. It's I'm gonna start off with an image. I usually like to show people images that you'd actually want to fix, all right? And this isn't an image you'd ever want to fix. I'm using it as an example to demonstrate the difference in camera raw between exposure and brightness, okay? That said, we're going to move to a regular photo in just a minute here, but this is a question that I get a lot, and it kind of gets demonstrated better when you can see it on a photo like this. So let's take a look here. The best thing we can do is let's play with the sliders. This is a plain black to white gradient. I went into Photoshop and posterized it a little so you could see the banding between this, and this is going to help us kind of figure out what's going on. When I increase exposure, watch what happens. You're going to slowly start to see these bands of light gray turn to white, and you're going to start to see this as it goes across the image as I increase exposure. So first, one of the things that you should notice is it happens pretty aggressively. All right, even at 1+1 stop, I've really pushed a lot of it toward white. All right, and imagine these light gray areas as being the lighter parts of your photo. All right, you're pushing them toward white, which is usually something we want to avoid depending on the photo, but most of the time we don't want to push things all the way to white. So we're starting to push it to white as I go higher and higher and higher. Okay, at the ends, there's not a whole lot left that isn't white. It pretty much goes over 3/4 of the image here, and then what is left, where you still start to see some detail here, it's actually been pretty aggressive at getting everything to white, and it's compressed everything that's left. So there's not a whole lot left here. There's not a whole lot of different tones left. We've got white, and we move to black very quickly. So what you've got over here are your light grays, your mid-tones, and these are kind of your shadow areas. You can see we've even pushed a lot of our shadowy areas that are over here almost toward white. So let's double click on this exposure slider. Now let's take a look at brightness. So brightness does the same thing, but what you should notice is as I approach a very high setting here, brightness is not as aggressive in doing what we just did, and in fact it only pushed about half of the image to white. It left the rest of it alone, okay? And it brightened it, but it didn't push it all the way toward white. So I shouldn't say it left it alone, it wasn't quite as aggressive as the exposure slider was, okay? So brightness has an overall kind of a brightening thing. It took just about everything except for the really bright areas of the image. It took everything and kind of brightened it a little bit. You have a lot less of a compressed area over here, so you see a lot more of these tones. Our shadows are still intact. They've just become brighter versus what happened with exposure where they almost became white. All right, so let's cancel out of here. Let's get to a photo. So how would we use this with a regular photograph? Well, you kind of, and here's where it gets a little subjective because there isn't a formula I can give you, but I can kind of show you what the two of them would do. Now, exposure. Let's go ahead and turn on our highlight warnings by clicking on that triangle up here. And as I increase the exposure, what you're going to see is that my sky starts to deteriorate pretty quickly here. And all I'm trying to do here is just bring out some of the shadowy areas inside of the boats. Okay, just kind of do an overall brightening, kind of make everything a little brighter, and just bring in a little bit of these areas over here. And you can see the sky starts to deteriorate pretty quickly. Okay, when I say deteriorate, all this clipping area shows me that it's turning to white. Well, that's kind of what we saw in that gradient. Remember, everything went very aggressive, and things that were on the brighter range really became pushed and blown out to white very quickly. We saw that gradient disappear. All right, so let's take a look at brightness. So as I start to increase brightness here, remember I still have my clipping warning on. All right, and you can see some of the little red spots of clipping down here, but we've pushed it all the way to the max, and yet we haven't really pushed the sky toward clipping. So what brightness is doing on this photo is it's giving an overall brightening. It's kind of brightening everything. It's brightening the dark areas down here, and it's brightening the sky as well. It just hasn't pushed it toward white. Okay, as opposed to exposure, which very aggressively goes against some of these brighter areas here and brings them up. Now, that said, most of the time exposure is what I'm going to use. I know in this example here you might be seeing it as a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not ever going to go up that high. All right. Hopefully my exposure is never that off where I have to go up that high. And that's why I use exposure most of the time, because I'm using it to brighten or to darken the brighter parts of my photo, which is typically where exposure works over in this area. If you're looking at a histogram, and again, you want to get a little techie, it's kind of pushing these areas bright really fast. But in this specific photo, you can see that, brightness could possibly be better because it's allowing me to get an overall brightening of the photo. All right, I'm brightening things at kind of a global scale here, but I'm not pushing anything toward white. So I'm able to see a little bit more detail inside of the boats here, but I'm not taking everything and just kind of mashing it and making it all pure white. Okay, so in the end, hopefully what I've done for you is just kind of, and I get the question a lot, what the difference between exposure and brightness is. So you got to feel for the difference, but hopefully what I've also left you with is, where would you want to use the two? I'd use brightness. Most of the time I use exposure, especially portraits and things like that, because brightness tends to make those look a little muddy and just kind of a little flat. And so when I use anything with portraits and whatnot, get the exposure slider. I'll use brightness when I think overall an image looks a little bit dark and I want to make everything brighter, not just the bright areas, which I might be afraid that they'll get pushed to white, as they do in this case. I'll just use the brightness slider just to kind of brighten things up on a global scale. All right. Well, folks, my name is Matt Kloskowski. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you again soon.